For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
Hey friends, welcome to For the Life of the World. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and today we're starting a 5-part book club series. It's produced and hosted by Kelly Corrigan on her podcast, Kelly Corrigan Wonders. The PBS host and author of 4 New York Times best-selling memoirs is taking a deep dive into the latest book from the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Written by Miroslav Volf, Matt Croasmun, and Ryan McAnnally-Linz, Life Worth Living, A Guide to What Matters Most. The book takes up some of the most pressing questions of life, as well as the historical and philosophical and religious traditions that have tried to answer those questions. But it doesn't keep the implications, challenges, the confusion, perplexity, the demands of those questions at arm's length. Both the course and the book invite lifelong learners to ask, for any given idea, if that idea were true, how would your life have to change? And based on your history, life experience, family, beliefs, and commitments, what is your vision of a life worth living? The series starts off today with a group conversation between Kelly, Miroslav, Matt, and Ryan, and it's followed up by a book club style sequence that Kelly Corrigan is hosting and features Kate Bowler, host of the Everything Happens podcast and associate professor of American Religious History at Duke Divinity School, as well as actress Claire Danes. Yes, the Claire Danes of Homeland, and if you're my age, the 90s MTV hit series, My So-Called Life. And when I heard that Claire Danes was going to join this podcast book club, I naturally suggested that the book club be called My So-Called Life Worth Living. This suggestion was not taken, and I have no hard feelings about this. If you're interested in reading along with Kelly, Kate, and Claire, please visit lifeworthlivingbook.com. That's where you can find links to buy the book, as well as a big old free discussion guide filled with questions for further reflection when you sign up for the Life Worth Living email list. Thanks for listening today, friends. Hope you enjoy this series.
Welcome back to Kelly Corrigan Wonders. Today begins our first book club series. 5 episodes back to back, working through a book called Life Worth Living, which is based on a very popular class at Yale. The idea came to us about a year ago when I recorded a conversation with a guy named Miroslav Volf. He immigrated here from Croatia. He is the founder and the director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and the younger brother of a 5-year-old who was killed by a soldier who his parents made a point of forgiving. In that unforgettable conversation, he talked about a course he's been teaching since 2014 with 2 other Yale professors, Matthew Croasmun and Ryan McAnnally-Linz, called Life Worth Living. I leaned in. I said, "Tell me more." He explained that the class is a semester-long look at the best thinking across time and culture on the biggest questions individuals put to themselves. What's worth doing? Who are we beholden to? How can we marry our values to our behavior? What should life feel like? I said, "Miroslav, when you get advanced copies, please send me one." He said he would, and he did. I found the book grounding and challenging. It gave me a focal point for all my wondering, and it seemed like the perfect guide for a larger discussion. So here we are. Today, I'll check in with the authors to tackle 4 big questions, and then for the following 3 episodes, I'll be book clubbing with 2 Yaleys, Claire Danes and Kate Bowler, in an attempt to answer many more. The final episode in this 5-part series will be a deep dive on my takeaways. So let's jump in with Miroslav Volf, Matt Croasmun, and Ryan McAnnally-Linz. So the 4 questions I want to talk about are, who do we answer to? How does a good life feel? What should we hope for? And how should we live? Okay?
Sounds good.
Who wants to take on the first question? Who do we answer
to?
Mm-hmm. I don't think I'd ever asked it. I mean, I don't think I've ever consciously considered, like, and this is a big, like, the book could have been called, like, When Push Comes to Shove, because every question gets narrower and narrower when you say, well, it can't be that you're responsible to your country and to the earth and to your mother and father. all at the same time. You'll need a hierarchy to turn to.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a kind of lower level responsibilities. I was thinking just recently about to whom I'm responsible. It had never occurred to me before to think that I might be responsible to people for whom I'm responsible. And then it occurred to me, I have this little daughter and I'm responsible for her. But as a matter of fact, I'm actually responsible to her. She does, in a sense, and she will hold me to account for the kind of life I have led before her and apart from her.
Oh, believe me, she'll hold you to account.
I know.
You get her to be 20, 21 years old, put her in therapy, you will be held to account. There will be a story told about you.
Yeah, there we go.
This is a question that came to us because a student demanded it.
We were in a retreat for the students to go get to know each other better kind of as humans rather than just fellow brains around the classroom table. And Orthodox Jewish woman listening to one of her colleagues answer a question about how they saw themselves engaging the world in the future and why they wanted to engage that way. And afterwards, there's time for questions. And the student looked and said, wait, who are you responsible to? Like, who gets to call you to account? What is it that gives structure, gives kind of responsibility to your life? And that question had never occurred to me before. Miroslav and I kind of looked at each other from across the room and said, well, we've had, I think, 4 course questions to this point. Now we have 5. And this is going to be there. And it's been there ever since.
We talk about these sort of 3 different sorts of responsibility because we think of this classic picture of Smokey the Bear sort of looking at you saying only you can prevent forest fires. And we try to break out, well, there's 3 different senses of responsibility right there in that one picture. There's that only you sense, and surely Smokey doesn't mean that only you can prevent, wildfires, not forest fires. Smokey,
Keep it straight. Keep it straight.
I know, it's important. Surely Smokey doesn't mean that only you, of all the humans on Earth, can prevent wildfires. But there is some responsibility that each of us has for our lives that we can't give away. We can't have for somebody else can't have for us. And then there's, of course, the responsibility for the wilds. And that's a different kind of responsibility. That's what Miroslav was calling responsibility for something or someone. But what we're trying to get at in the chapter, and the question that often we haven't asked ourselves, is this question about, what about Smokey responsibility? What about this bear who's got his paw pointed at you? What about that kind of responsibility? But it's interesting. We pulled those 3 apart, but actually then they start to come back together because it sometimes is those for whom we are responsible are also those to whom we are responsible. And of course, there's also this possibility, which we entertain in the book, that maybe that only you responsibility actually plays a sort of double role. There are those who propose that because you have a responsibility for your life that nobody else has, maybe that's all you need. Maybe you are the one sort of pointing at yourself in the mirror somehow, calling yourself to account for living as your most authentic sort of self in that way.
Right. But then that's sort of undercut, like the idea that you probably don't use these kinds of words in class, but like, is it a valid answer to say, hey man, it's like me, and all I can do is control what I do on this earth, and it's my job to make myself happy. And if everybody took that work seriously for themselves, there would be no shared responsibility. Like, do you hear that in class? Are there some Yale econ majors who are like, I'll know who I'm responsible to?
They're not all econ majors. But we hear this a lot, and it's part of why, from the beginning of the course, I think it's something that over the years we kept trying to find more and more space for, was trying to interact with students over this possibility that maybe we answer only to ourselves. And actually a text that's been really important to us in that respect is this short little book written by Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher who generally doesn't write short little books, but wrote a short little book called Ethics of Authenticity, in which he tries to take that answer really seriously, as seriously perhaps as one can. But what's interesting, at least on my read, and we've had a little bit of discussion about this around the office, on my read, I take it that when Taylor gives that rich account of what it would be to feel responsible to oneself, to live as one's most authentic self, that actually that responsibility ends up being not
to oneself. It ends up being, maybe I have to live as my most authentic self because that's who God has called me to be, or whom God has created me to be in some sort of sense.
Well, wait, can we pause for 1 second and define authenticity?
Yeah.
Because that's like an Instagram word. And I don't know if everybody thinks of it the same way. And what I'm hearing when you're saying that is like, well, I'm angry right now, so I'm going to scream at the whole family. Or you irritate me. And so my authentic self is saying, you're irritating me.
Right. Yeah. And I think one thing...
You don't irritate me. I just want to say you don't irritate me at all.
Thank you, Kelly.
I feel that way.
We have plenty of time here.
Yeah.
Just you wait.
Hang in there.
I think one of the important things to recognize is that with most all of the answers to most all of these questions, there are deeper and shallower versions of it. And so responsibility to yourself, that can be a kind of shallow egoism where you think of yourself mostly in terms of like whatever it is that you happen to desire at a given time, however it is that you happen to be feeling, and you're only responsible for yourself. So you're just like, you do you and you get yours, right?
Yeah, you scratch every itch.
Yep. And that's really different from thinking that there's some sort of deep kernel to you. Maybe it hasn't ever really been realized before. It's something that needs to be discovered. And in the discovery, it kind of gets reshaped and changed, and then you have to live it out. And it can be a kind of interior measure that's you. It's not somebody other than you, but it's like a you that's different from the you who just happens to be showing up today because you didn't eat enough breakfast and now you're cranky and you saw a post online that you didn't like, or
below your moods.
Yeah.
Below your activities.
But I'm wondering also whether, in fact, if one analyzed with students their own experiences, whether they would, in the end, even those who seem to be responsible only to themselves, whether they would, in the end, admit that actually other people, other things seep into that sense of responsibility for myself, so that it's more the ideology almost of the self that they have created. I'm responsible for myself to assert a kind of independence in the world, but when it came actually to concrete situations, that they would point to other people to whom they feel responsible.
Right, because there is this setup in the book that I really appreciated, which is the statement of your values and the reveal of your values. So like what you would put on a piece of paper about your values versus like what your budget says, what your calendar says, what your mind share says.
Yeah.
Because that's where the rubber hits the road.
And in some ways, I mean, it's one of the tasks of the book and of the course as well, to kind of tease out those implicit commitments that people have and implicit responsibilities and put them to surface so that they can be illuminated in conversation with other perspectives.
And sometimes you see them as being really worthy of investing in. And sometimes you see them and you say, oh, shit. Like, how is it that that's what I actually value? Because
that's right.
If you ask me, that is not what I value.
Totally. I mean, I think of it as wallpaper because it came up in my first conversation with Miroslav on the pod a year ago, was that I had just paid to have wallpaper hung on a wall in my apartment. And I was like, well, I guess that's what you value because that's what you did with your money. Like you had a little extra money and that's what you did with it. You bought some wallpaper. Mm-hmm. So like you can say all you want, but that's what you did with your money. And that's what I did with my time because I went to the store and I had to pick all the different wallpapers. And then I came home with my samples and I hung them up and I asked my friends and I asked my husband and then I found a guy to hang it. And, you know, like that's a lot of time and energy and mind share and money. So you got to get real about that, which is just you're so gentle about that in the book, but it is there in black and white. Like look at your budget, look at your schedule and investigate your mind share. Yeah. So the second question I want to get to is, to the extent that you feel you're living a good life, how does your life feel? Miroslav Volf, I'm looking at you.
I'm avoiding your look. No, yes. I think to the extent that I'm living a good life, my life feels, or I feel, kind of in sync with what is happening around me. I feel that I'm not aloof taken out of what is happening and living in some kind of a bubble that I've created for myself that may feel like a good life, but in fact wouldn't be a good life, because part of the good life is for circumstances to be of a certain kind for people and not just for me. So in that sense, it seems like first order of business for me is to be attuned to where I am and where people are, which means lament, which means rejoicing, which means sense of kind of puzzlement at things, which means all the range of emotions that we experience that is appropriate to the complexity of life that we live. But it seems also that just like I have certain kind of hopes for the set of arrangements in which I might live, set of circumstances, just as I might have certain hopes for a kind of type of life that I would actively live. So I have certain expectations, hopes for the emotional life, the kind of the pinnacle of what will be the good life. And I think that for me would be something like joy. I can see how other folks might think in different ways about it. Something like much more quiet than the joy is. Something like a certain kind of contentment, certain sense of peacefulness in the circumstances. But even there, I think there may be complexity to the experience of the good, and then be in the tune with that good. And for me, that would express itself in either quiet or kind of exuberant joy.
Attunement is a really interesting word. You said it a couple times in a couple different forms just then. And I think about the Frank Conroy story that you tell in the book about being on a cruise.
Yeah, so we only really know about this because David Foster Wallace wrote his really famous essay, A Supposedly Fun Thing That I'll Never Do Again. He went on a cruise after Frank Conroy, this other writer, had been kind of paid to go on a cruise and write up a very like writerly blurb, in effect, of the cruise. And he's looking at his cruise experience and saying, wow, I didn't have to do a single thing. Everything was done for me. I didn't have to think about anything. The hardest decision I had to make was like, what movie am I going to watch today?
Right.
And
no dishes, no cooking.
No dishes, no cooking. And there's this vacancy where there should be all of the other human beings who are making all of this happen, right? That depends on the pitiful wages that are being paid to the galley crew, the like 12-hour days that they're working, all of this sort of stuff. And it strikes me, at least, as a sort of striking lack of attunement. And then when you get David Foster Wallace on the cruise ship, he's feeling all of that and all of the like kind of vacuity that shows up in this way of life when you start to notice what it's occluding, what you could be attuned with, right? You're like supposed to ignore it. And I think a lot of us lead lives that are set up to block out massive portions of the world. And I mean, I can understand it. Like there's too much. Let's like posit that the world exceeds us. Like we can't take it all in. We can't be attuned with everything all the time.
I mean, you'd lose your mind.
To be attuned to everything is not possible, right? So there's got to be some kind of middle way in between a sort of calcified blindness and sort of like you write your own melody and like you're kind of humming your own tune, oblivious to the world.
Right.
And on the flip side, kind of trying to bring it all in all at once and somehow like handle the whole mess of things.
Right. It's a total requirement of a good life for me to figure out what to do with that on a minute by minute basis, such that I'm neither callous nor paralyzed. Coming up next, Miroslav, Matt, Ryan, and I talk about the surprising benefits of negative emotions and how they can contribute to a life worth living. We'll be right back with Kelly Corrigan Wonders. Welcome back to Kelly Corrigan Wonders. I'm Kelly Corrigan, and I'm talking to the authors of Life Worth Living, A Guide to What Matters Most. Yale theologians Miroslav Volf, Matthew Croasmun, and Ryan McAnnally-Linz. Before we jump back into the conversation with Miroslav, Matt, and Ryan, I wanted to make a suggestion. that you share this podcast with anyone you know and love who might be feeling a little lost, anyone who's at a crossroads and needs some guidance, maybe even a new graduate who's thinking about their life ahead and how they might want that life to look and feel. All right, let's rejoin the conversation. There's that Oscar Wilde quote that you guys have in here about sadness being a totally appropriate response. And that takes me into this moment in our culture where many negative emotions have been labeled by the DSM as something that requires treatment rather than receiving them as signals to be interpreted and processed. How do you think about that?
Nobody thought in terms of positive and negative emotions until very recently in human history, right? Like the fact that you can kind of like put emotions into two buckets and say there are positive ones and negative ones. Yeah, there's a sense that some of them feel good and some of them don't and all of that. But I think we tend to reduce our emotions to are they positive or negative and how intense are they? And you get this kind of single axis. And then anything that moves you in the negative direction starts to look like sheer loss. There's no sense in which the negative could be positive, right? Because you're thinking just in terms of negative and positive, rather than having a kind of richer emotional vocabulary that names specific modes of response to the world as it is for you, right? You go back and you read like a Jane Austen novel, and the kind of emotions that the characters have there, you realize they're making distinctions that you've never considered before. Like what is the difference between contentment and happiness and joy and elation, right? Those are all just kind of like on the good side for us, right? And I think the pathologizing of the negative is related to the kind of washing out of these distinctions, which are, I think, embedded in that kind of attunement model of thinking about our affective lives.
And it totally devalues negative emotions. It doesn't recognize that they could be instructive or in some way superior in their benefit.
Yeah, there could be a goodness there to them that doesn't depend on their feeling good or like having immediate kind of positive consequences for you.
But it fits an account of the good life that is associated with pleasure, and the bad life is associated with pain. And if you spread the entirety of life along this axis of pain and pleasure, that has then ramifications for how you experience your emotions.
Right. And it's such a disservice. It's such a terrible disservice to let this stand, this negative emotion story.
If the good life is instead indexed to truth, I think that's when sort of questions of attunement become central, right? So the summer of 2020, our colleague, Willie James Jennings, trying to help us respond to sort of the racial reckoning that summer, recorded a piece for our podcast in which he named his righteous anger and invited us to share with him his righteous anger as an African-American theologian in the United States in 2020. He said, I am angry. And he said something like, and when people tell me I can't know how you feel, it's like, well, maybe that's true, but I want you actually to enter into this anger with me.
Right.
Because anger is the proper response to what is happening in the world. And we share a context, a truth, a reality of the situation in this country, in this example, where the right thing to feel is angry.
Right.
That's what I mean by if the good life is indexed to truth or to reality, then responding, like emoting truthfully, becomes the index of what the good life ought to feel. I spend a lot of time with the Apostle Paul. It's my specialty. And he says two things.
Does he work here?
Yeah, he's not able to join us today. Well, there's an icon of him over at my desk.
Fantastic. We'll bring him in.
We'll bring him in. But he says two things in his letters. On the one hand, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. So he somehow thinks that he can command us to rejoice, which is itself a sort of bizarre idea. But then at the same time, he also says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. And there's a bit of a theological puzzle there about how do you rejoice always while also mourning? And maybe quick shorthand for that would be something like the film Inside Out. You can feel two emotions at the same time. It's possible that maybe most of the most truthful, honest sort of moments in our lives actually are colored in just such ways. But I take it that that is what's indexing our emotional life for him. It's solidarity, but not just emotional solidarity for its own sake, just sort of feeling with someone. It's feeling with people in attunement with what is true and what's real in the world.
Right.
And sometimes what's happening in the world is cause for joy. Sometimes what's happening in the world is cause for mourning. Sometimes what's happening in the world is cause for anger.
Well, at all times, it's cause for joy, mourning, anger. Like all things are happening at all moments.
Right.
Like that's the simultaneity thing that's so trippy when you get there, is that there's reasons right now for all of us to be furious and delighted and wowed and disgusted. I remember when Claire was born, I didn't have time for an epidural. And so I had to, go in for the whole thing. And I never would have signed up for it in a million years. Like I know that I'm a weak woman and I want all the modern comforts that medicine has developed. And then I got to have the experience of an almost 10-pound baby moving through my body and out into the world without any medication. And I'm so grateful to know what that feels like. And per your remark about solidarity, I think about women around the world who don't have the option for an epidural, who are like walking out to a field with their midwife friend and having a baby in the reeds and thinking like, I know something that you know. We know something together. And I almost didn't because I never would have asked for it. And I think maybe there's something to that where if we have the negative, if everything is either good or bad, then we're going to have a whole bunch of people avoiding the whole quote unquote bad stuff. And therefore, all of the things that develop in that space will be dormant in us and we'll just be less capable and more fragile and less useful to one another.
And in that way, I think, or in that sense, there is almost like an art of feeling that can be cultivated. And it depends what you allow yourself to be attuned with and whether you can see two things at the same time and therefore feel two things or more things at the same time. So I think it requires not simply, as sometimes we think about emotions, they're almost like reactions. But I don't think emotions are reactions simply. I think emotions are kind of intentional stances toward the world. They're a way of reading the world and emotional responding in attunement. And in that sense, one can cultivate the emotional life so that it expresses and it has this appropriate richness.
Right. Okay. The third question is, what should we hope for? One thing that comes up early in that chapter is the difference between Aristotle and his idea of flourishing, which is sort of defined as a well-off, respected family, children you can be proud of, and personal beauty, which is not like he's not really killing it there, Aristotle. And
well,
then
it's also not all that ancient. It sounds pretty modern.
Well, except that what was ancient was relatively stable then, whereas now it's out of this world dynamic, and so what you're satisfied in terms of beauty or reputation and so forth today, tomorrow you won't be.
Right.
Because it's changing all the time.
And then you slide right into the Buddha and the question about wealth and power as desirable to one culture or big time thinker. BTT, we'll call them, the big time thinkers.
The actual members of your seminar.
That's right.
Those are the more important members of your seminar.
That's right. These guys are conduits. The BTTs are really who's here on the table.
Right.
So you have one guy saying like, that's it. And then the next guy's saying, not only is that not it, that is the impediment.
Yeah.
That's the obstacle. And to the extent that you don't see that, is to the extent that you'll suffer infinitely.
And that's one of those moments when you realize that there are disagreements like that. Because you might think like, oh yeah, what kind of circumstances make up a good life? It's pretty obvious. Like you want things like wealth and power and influence. And if you're choosing between beauty and ugliness, like beauty's better, right?
Yes, but just to say, we say these in much more subtle ways. Like you would say, I want the chance to do good work, which means you want influence and you want some power, little interpersonal power. I want to be able to do this podcast and able to do this podcast. I need a little bit of power because you have to answer the phone when I call. And Random House has to give me these books for the giveaway. And we got to get on the Today Show to get people to watch this thing. So it can be hidden in something that feels kind of unassailably pure, but it's right there. It's right around the edge of almost everything everybody wants to do. I mean, you guys want to teach at the Yale Divinity School. Yeah. No, I mean, I should say, I'm not all the way with the Buddha on this. Because I think there are things like callings that require certain sort of resources and whatnot. But I think it's really important to recognize that there are lots of folks out there saying, no, what you call good is bad for you. And the story with the Buddha is he has a son right before he goes off to seek enlightenment, and he doesn't even stop to kiss his son on the way out the door, because if he does, he might get stuck, right? He might not go. He might not go through with it. He might be attached to this guy. And the Buddha's dad names the son Rahula, which means impediment. You're an obstacle, bud. Yeah. That's a lot of therapy. That's a lot of therapy coming down the pike on that one. Buddha goes off. He finds enlightenment. He starts teaching people, and he comes back to town, and his, I guess, ex-wife at this point, sends out the son to say, "Give me my inheritance. You were a prince. I should be a prince too, right? I should have all this stuff that you had." And the Buddha thinks about it and says, "Well, if I were to give him that, I would be giving him impediments." Right. It's a carton of rotten eggs. Exactly. And so what I'm going to give you instead is this teaching that will show you the truth of things. And that it's a moment to reframe and to make sure that those sort of things that we're sneaking in to our hopes are worth being there. Right. I do have a hunch, and this is kind of from my Christian perspective, that wealth in particular is a very dangerous thing. There's a decent chance it's bad for your soul, and yet to live like that is a challenge, right? And so it's really important to let these folks grab you. Right. One extreme is your own son is an impediment to your life. Kind of the other, maybe not extreme, or something way we tend to generally live without thinking too much, is pretty heavy investment in variety of worldly goods. You mentioned earlier power. There's certain kind of, but we need not call it wealth. We can call it certain kinds of needs that we need to satisfy by things like a little house and the car, maybe two cars, whatever that might be, and that's being stated in the name of affirmation of the goodness of ordinary material things. And this has been historically so in the West and many other places for many years, but especially in modernity. But then you think connecting that with ecology and environment, wouldn't some form of asceticism be not an expression of kind of despising the material goods, but actually affirming them, realizing that all the material goods and circumstances of our lives they come to us as part of this ecosystem of which we are also a part. And therefore, in order to be truly wealthy and truly appreciate material things, we need to see them in the context of the entirety of what happens on this globe. And once you start thinking that way, a certain form of this worldly asceticism settles in, where you need to detach yourself from certain investments that you have in things, so as to be able not just yourself live a life that is good, but also other people, other creatures, and other human beings. Right. That's a big thought. What percentage of people do you think like that in America? One. Honestly, that's such a big thought. One person or one? There is a lonely voice in the wilderness. It could be one. There could be. If you are the one person who's thought that thing, please write in. We'll send you a signed book. But maybe that's one of these things where people don't think that way. But if you actually would try to tease out what their convictions are, that they would see themselves going in that direction.
that they seem to feel that my own good isn't just simply my own good. My own material goods cannot be isolated from everybody else's.
If I'm living in such a way, which every single one of us is, that is creating harm, little circles and ripples of harm all around us, what are we to do about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, why not just have one shirt and one pair of pants? Here's a question to like get down to brass
You would
tacks.
judge me.
I know. Irritating. Don't irritate me. Is there something that in the last month that you have felt rise up in you like, well, I kind of want that, and then thought, no, I don't need that. I don't want that. How often do you have to peel your hands off of an object and say, I'm going to leave this. I don't want it?
Every day.
Every day.
I do. I'm driving my Honda Fit and I see an electric car and I said, oh my goodness, I should sell this car. I should get rid of this car and buy myself whatever.
I don't even know what a Honda
Tesla.
Fit is. What's a Honda Fit?
Honda Fit is...
Both of these guys drive Honda Fits.
And this podcast is being sponsored by Honda Fit,
Which they took off the market.
That's fantastic for us. Right.
For what it's worth, I drive the wimpiest battery car. I drive a Nissan Leaf, which sometimes looks longingly at their Fits that can drive more than 70 miles between Phillips.
Did you know that it's Lent when you asked that question?
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
But don't tell my mom that. Mom, I knew it was Lent.
When you said how often do you have to pry your
Stop
hands
yourself.
off the thing? Yeah, I thought of there was a time in my life where I was regularly watching a lot of HGTV.
No, you weren't.
I was.
Wow.
And
Do you not have that look?
What's HGTV?
And this is when Miroslav left the Divinity School and went hard to like sell it or buy it.
Exactly. You haven't met Chip and Joanna yet. Home and Garden TV, is that what it says?
Yeah,
I assume?
I believe.
But
It's
all
like a home improvement network. Every single show. Wallpaper. Think wallpaper.
But what it is it's a cultivation of a certain sort of desires,
Totally.
right? Like this is so much more insidious than advertising.
Yeah.
Right? Because like it's just creating in you all sorts of desires that you didn't have.
Yes.
And you start to walk around your house thinking, well, that fireplace clearly needs to be refaced.
Right.
And
If Chip and Joanna came here, they'd paint that thing white in 2 seconds flat.
yeah, exactly. Seriously, right? That chandelier needs to be spherical or, I'm just not with the times or whatever. Yeah.
So you had to be in terms of practices,
right.
you have to be so careful what you put in front of your eyes.
But again, it's that stopping. Yeah, it's that stopping.
Like, don't go to the mall.
Go one step earlier, right? Like if you're having a hard time prying your hand off of whatever home improvement you want to do off the wallpaper, maybe the step earlier is to say, what kind of media diet am I exposing myself
Stop
to
reading
that
Eldecor.
creates in me this sort of desire for this? Of whatever home improvement you want to do off the wallpaper, maybe the step earlier is to say, what kind of media diet am I exposing myself
Stop
to
reading
that
Eldecor.
creates in me this sort of desire for this?
I love Eldecor.
I see now.
You don't know what it is. Look out!
Yeah, no, I
Look out!
know
It
that.
will go. It will get into your mind.
Is this the higher class version of HGTV?
Yeah,
Okay.
way higher.
Right.
Okay, the last one I want to talk about is how should we live? So let me get to that section.
That's simple.
Oh, it is?
No.
It never is.
Yeah. So it says most of the time it's a series of small, seemingly insignificant decisions and non-decisions. It's made up of habits and assumptions and incremental changes. The shape of who we are and how we live isn't like Stonehenge. It's not made by stacking a few massive rocks on top of one another. It's built up over time, brick by brick. So this is where you make it crystal clear that this is not a self-help book, because there is not going to be a list at the end where you tell us how to roll. Do your students go bananas when you get to this part of the course? Are they like pounding their fists on the table saying, give us something, give us a practice?
I once had a student who I thought was sort of the most receptive student one could ever hope for. Not only did they take the course, we did an independent study together. And somewhere about 2/3 of the way through the independent study, it became clear that this was bordering on pedagogical malpractice because this student was sort of drowning in like an unceasing asking of the questions without any recourse to actually do something in the world. And they were just piling up yet more and more sort of subtle ways of sort of thinking critically about their own life, or even more so about their own vast responsibilities and a sense of just sort of growing burden of what they weren't doing.
We cannot leave people there.
We cannot leave people there. I mean, this is part of what came, with the what's worth wanting sort of diving analogy at the beginning of the book, right? That was the moment that sort of made me think, oh, there's a possibility of like going under the water and never coming back up for air. Like that would be drowning, right? And this student and I were sort of drowning together. Right?
Yeah.
And it does require sort of turning to practices. What we actually do in our university course is, because we're going through in that course sort of by tradition rather than by question, for each tradition, we have a session of the course that's on a sort of signature practice of the tradition. So when we have our encounter with various Jewish visions of a good life, we have a whole session on Shabbat and thinking about rest. Yeah, thinking about our rhythms of work and rest. And that becomes both a sort of lens through which we can see the whole of the tradition, right? So that all sorts of things that maybe you've been reading in various Jewish authors start to sort of make sense through this sort of lens of like, oh, okay, I'm starting to see this actually turn into, the feet are hitting the pavement here. This is getting put into action. But it's also this sort of practical thing that you might try,
right?
To sort of think about, what are my rhythms of work and rest? At Yale, the answer is poor and sort of self-destructive, right? Maybe slightly different versions of that, but that's always what they are. And then we sort of have a moment, and it's every 3 seminars or so, we sort of have this moment to say, okay.
What are some other practices that you point out and discuss as a class? Do you do meditation?
We don't do meditation.
But does it come up when you're talking about Buddhism?
Yeah, for sure.
Particularly like loving compassion meditation. We talk about prayer in Islam, praying 5 times a day. What do you do ritualistically 5 times a day, if anything?
Other than check, Instagram or whatever it might be.
Well, maybe not like
that
may be what you see. And again, you're in the position of, okay, like, what do I do with that? But then forgiveness, giving. So
like giving alms.
So like we talk about utilitarianism.
Yes.
And so it's like, well, this view suggests you should probably be giving most of your money away. Let's talk about that.
What would that feel like?
Yeah.
How do you spend your money, and how might you make some changes? And
I was scared by that. There's a chapter in the book that says this, or the little section in the book that says this book might ruin your life. And the most immediate way that it ruined my life is that I started giving away way more money. Way more.
Oh, all right.
It was worth it.
I'm done.
Yeah.
Our work is done here.
Yeah. In fact, we did a little thing where we had 100% luxury tax. Like Edward wanted to buy this bike. My husband likes to ride bikes. Nothing could be more expensive or irritating. You think you're irritating? Wait till you meet Edward. He wants, a gravel bike and a road bike and a mountain bike, and they're all different. They all require different things. They have special shoes, and then they have the pants, and then they have the wind guards, and it just is endless. And I said, okay, well then it was right when that horrible earthquake happened. And I was like, whatever you spend, give the exact same amount to the penny to the earthquake. And he's like, really? Like, can I do it? And I was like, uh-huh. And then I looked at your book and said, God damn it. Those guys are going to bleed me dry. But you just brought up a practice that was kind of interesting.
Fasting.
That also can serve to organize almost your entire life because you start thinking, why would you do that? What happens with your desires? How do you manage your desires? What happens to food, which is so fundamental to our well-being, our existence itself? And you are saying there's something that might be, at least for time being, more important than that which seems like it is most important in my life, namely food.
Right.
And it almost seems like Sabbath, almost like a meta practice that practices you in all sorts of domains.
Right. In a way, it's all practices that help you see things anew. Like to see your hunger anew, or to see your desire anew, or to see your dollars anew, or to see your day anew.
And fasting and Sabbath, and I think sort of giving in certain ways, also sort of speak to potentially the goodness of at least some limits in our lives. We're really inclined to sort of identify limits and break through them. Suddenly had Elsa in my head. But maybe there are some limits that are actually good in our lives. And I mean, you sort of imposing upon yourself, right? I will charge myself a 100% luxury tax, right? You're like imposing a limit that would be good. We are finite beings. And I think especially in our modern moment, we try to live in rebellion against that reality so often. And so many of these ancient practices sort of invite us to come back into some sort of alignment, attunement with the reality of our finitude, that there's a limit to our days. There's a limit to our appetites, just to put some boundaries. And that I remember it lasted a pitifully short amount of time, but in the morning I'd have my steel-cut oats. And I remember having a morning, I sort of thought I was about to pour in all, the heaping piles of brown sugar. What if I didn't this morning, right? And just the experience of what is it like to eat this precisely not the way that I most enjoy it, right? And was in my capacity to do so, right? But is there something to be learned there, and it's sort of experiencing that boundary?
In and of itself, it's a practice. And to the extent that practices can become habits, then the cognitive load of living according to your values gets lighter. And that's really where I wanted to end is there a habit that you have that you find has allowed you to live closer to your values without quite as much effort?
For me, it's Sabbath. My wife and I happened to buy a house in a predominantly Orthodox Jewish community. And for years, it was when I was finishing my dissertation, I would sit there on Friday nights and I would be just banging my head against the wall, trying to eke out some last little bit of productivity late on a Friday evening. And I would hear the sound from downstairs of our Orthodox Jewish neighbors, two little girls who lived downstairs. And basically every Friday night after service was just like a slumber party at their house. And so there'd be like 10 little girls downstairs just having a ball. And I remember thinking, these kids know something that I need to learn. And so in our own sort of weak sauce, modern Christian sort of way, we've taken up a Sabbath practice as a family. We do it in sync with our neighborhood, sundown to sundown, Friday to Saturday. And that has just changed my own sense of my own like importance, right? That there's like whatever I'm doing can be put down for 24 hours. Like the world will go on. And that's been a practice that's been absolutely a lifeline for me and for my family.
Yeah. How about you? Do you have a practice?
One of the practices that we've also discussed and tried to kind of inculcate students associated with Christianity was practice of forgiveness. And though it's not as structured as some other practices, nonetheless, I think for me that's really important, almost like a daily practice in small things, to have acts of forgiveness, to basically say to myself, no, this other person isn't some of his or her deeds. And strangely enough, it kind of frees me to see myself also more than some of things that I have suffered, right? As if I had to defend that turf, as if there was not something much more important about me and about another person than what has at certain moment transpired between us.
Mm-hmm. I think I might be a mess. What can I say? Nothing as good as Sabbath and forgiveness. This is going to maybe sound more pious than it is, or like more, or at least as boring as it is.
Expectations are effectively lowered.
Going to church, like that's what I do on, it turns out, Sunday afternoons. Not 100% of the time, but the great bulk of the time. When I'm traveling, I try to do it if I can. And there's the kind of the pre-made decision factor is really important. And like, why would one do such a thing? Oftentimes, church is boring. You don't feel like you're doing something spiritual.
Yeah, you're like punching in and punching out sometimes.
Yeah, but there's a kind of commitment to say that it's maybe a little bit like the Sabbath thing, and that like, hey, some of this time needs to be dedicated to the fact that none of this time is strictly speaking my own. Recognize that, and to do that with other people, because whatever this form of life is that I'm striving for, it's not just me, and it's not just my family, and it's not just the people that I like or want to be there. It's a bunch of people with a horizon towards a whole world. So I think it's just a way of kind of shaping my relation to my life as knit into a broader tapestry of communities that extends across space and over time, and that recognizes at some level that as I see it, what we're doing here is receiving a gift. And as much as we can say, like only you have the responsibility for your life, you don't own it.
I think that's why I like taking the subway. I like being immersed in a big group of people, not of my choosing, and to sort of go eyeball to eyeball and give little smiles to people. And, it started with the moms of the cute little kids. So it started with the little kids, then it goes to the moms. Then it goes to the other mom who's noticing me notice the mom and the kid. And then it starts spreading the whole way around the little subway car and taking in the reality of the people around me and, the drunk guy in the corner and the guy with no shoes, and the whole tapestry is right there in every subway car in New York City. And I could leave it all behind. I could stay above ground. And there's something about being one of many that's such a release. It's so wonderful to be one of us. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for your beautiful book. Thanks for your beautiful class. We're going to learn a lot.
How nice is the wallpaper?
It's fucking awesome. Here are my takeaways from my conversation with Miroslav, Matt, and Ryan about what makes a life worth living. Number 1, someday, like it or not, your children will probably hold you to account for their childhood. Number 2, we can't possibly be attuned with everything all the time. The world exceeds us. But that doesn't mean we should set up our lives to block out everything hard and ugly about life on Earth today. Number 3, many negative emotions have been labeled by the DSM as something that requires treatment, rather than receiving them as signals to be interpreted and processed. Number 4, you can feel 2 emotions at the same time, even 2 emotions that conflict. Number 5, what if the goal isn't experiencing happiness? It's emoting truthfully. Number 6, it's okay to want things, wallpaper, new cars, so long as you catch yourself. Number 7, everything, the good, the bad, the mixed, the disguised, is incremental. We'll get there. It'll just be slowly. Thank you to Miroslav Volf, Matthew Croasmun, Ryan McAnnally-Linz. Thanks to everyone at Yale Divinity, as well as the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, particularly Evan Rosa, who has been so helpful to us and a joy to work with. Also, special thanks to the Warren Smoot Carter III and Megan Carter Charitable Fund. Thanks also to the team at Kelly Corrigan Wonders. That's technical producer Dean Kateri, executive producer Tammy Stedman, graphic designer Gagi, audience outreach coordinators Charlie Upchurch and Rachel Hicks. And thanks to you all for listening and sharing. We'll be back on Friday with a new For the Good of the Order, and on Sunday with a new Thanks for Being Here. Please join us again next time for our first conversation with Claire Danes and Kate Bowler about life worth living on Kelly Corrigan Wonders. Until then, I'll see you on Instagram at Kelly Corrigan.
The Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Kelly Corrigan, Miroslav Volf, Matt Croasmun, and Ryan McAnnally-Linz. Special thanks to Tammy Stedman and Kelly Corrigan, as well as the Warren Smoot Carter III and Megan Carter Charitable Fund. For more information about the Life Worth Living book, visit lifeworthlivingbook.com. And for more information about the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, visit faith.yale.edu. It's the end of this episode, and what can you do now? Well, I have a different suggestion this week. Why don't you share this series with a group of friends? Listen to this 5-part series together, read through the Life Worth Living book, and see what comes of it. Thanks for listening, friends, and we'll be back with more soon.